Morning to all of you. There are many familiar faces in this room for me. I'm Mary Perry, and I have the distinct pleasure of getting to moderate this panel this morning. All of us have been talking about the subject of adequacy those of us who've been around as long as I have been talking about the subject of funding adequacy for many years. And so this new research will help give us additional evidence to that degree. So I see that not enough state funding pops up as your opinion about what the biggest barrier is. There we are. So it is very germane to what we're going to talk about today. Let me introduce our panelists very briefly, and then we'll start with Paul Bruno. But Paul Bruno is with USC Rossier School and did a report looking at a lot of data. So if you like charts, his is the report you want to go to. Ileana Bradziak de los Reyes and Jesse Levin are with AIR, and they did the adequacy study that Susanna talked about using professional judgment. And Jennifer Imazeki looked at a comparison of California's funding system with other states. So we have a lot of stuff to talk about today, and we will just get right into it with Paul's presentation first.
Time myself here. So hi, I'm Paul Bruno. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California. My contribution to the Getting Down to Facts project is a descriptive look at school district finances in the state. I look at a range of topics looking at the composition and level of school district revenues and expenditures, indicators of financial health. I take a look at how those things differ across districts with different characteristics. And how those things have changed over time since 2004-05, which is when the last Getting Down to Facts project looked at some of these issues. Take a brief look at how county offices of education and joint powers authorities spend their money, which I think is sometimes overlooked in discussions of school finance in California. And then I do a brief comparison of California to other states. I'm obviously not going to talk about all of this. I just want to highlight a few of the main takeaways that will maybe drive some of the conversation today or inform some of that conversation. So one of the main takeaways is that California districts are a better resource now on a per student basis than they have been in a long time, since at least 2004-05, probably before then. What I've done here is I've broken out revenues, average district revenues per student from different sources over time. You can see declines after the start of the recession, and then increases in recent years driven to a large extent by increases in local control funding formula revenue, what used to be called revenue limit funding, primarily for most districts that represent state aid. And because a lot of funding reforms in California have not only increased district revenues, but also relaxed restrictions on how districts can spend their money, districts have a lot more spending flexibility than they used to. So that's due both to the fact they're getting more money per student and also because the state has relaxed a lot of restrictions on how that money be spent. These increases in funding mean that California is starting to catch up, so to speak, in terms of per student spending to districts in other parts of the country. As you can see here, California districts tended to spend less on average per student than districts elsewhere in the country on average. California districts were also hit particularly hard after the recession. That's due in part to the fact that California districts are relatively dependent on state aid as opposed to local revenue, and they also face a lot of restrictions on their ability to raise additional revenue locally. You can see that the gap starting to close in the first couple of years of the local control funding formula, as those are the most recent years for which data are available. It'll be interesting to keep an eye on that gap over time. Some of the biggest increases that we would expect to see in California district revenues happened in those first couple of years of the local control funding formula, so it's not clear how much more we should expect that gap to close. And it's also important to keep in mind, as I think Susanna mentioned before, is that these figures are adjusted for inflation, but they're not adjusted for things like differences in cost of living or cost of labor in different parts of the country. The local control funding formula does target additional resources to districts with different levels of student disadvantage under the local control funding formula. Those are unduplicated pupils or students who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. English learners or foster youth, and we do see a positive relationship in district resources, between district resources and their unduplicated pupil percentages, how many of those students that they have. But there is still a fair amount of variation. That's something I think is important to keep in mind. Even as we focus on the local control funding formula, there's a lot of other moving pieces in school district finance. So just as an example here, I've broken out per student revenues from different sources on average for districts with different unduplicated pupil percentages. So you can see that, for example, LCFF revenue does increase for districts with larger unduplicated pupil shares, but are actually also relatively high for districts with relatively small unduplicated pupil shares. Those are often what are called basic aid districts that are able to raise so much money locally that they're not actually dependent on state aid to meet their LCFF targets. And those districts with very small unduplicated pupil percentages also can raise other kinds of local revenue that are not counted in LCFF calculations. So LCFF is obviously very important in California school finance, but there are other moving parts that are worth keeping an eye on as well. So California school districts are getting more money than they used to. What are they spending it on? Here what I've done is I've broken out sort of operational spending per student. I've indexed it to 2004-05 and adjusted it for inflation. So what we're looking at here is percentage change in per student spending on different things. The solid black line here is just overall spending per student. So you can see that declining after the recession and then increasing in recent years. And then what I've done is I've broken out spending by districts' goals when they do their spending, whether they're spending it on general education or special education. What you can see here is that spending on special education has increased substantially. That's by about 45% per student since 2004-05, and has tended even to at least stay flat or even increase, even as overall spending is falling. So as Susanna mentioned before, special education is increasingly important to district budgets. General education spending has generally increased generally not kept up with overall spending. If instead we break it down by what districts are the objects, the goods or services that districts are buying with their money, here I've broken out staff benefit spending versus staff salary spending per student. And you can see that staff benefit spending, is that top line up there, is up by much more per student than staff salary spending per student. The second line down there underneath the overall spending line, that solid dark line, is spending on staff salaries of any kind per student, which is up by about 11% since 2004-05. But teacher salaries, if you just look at teacher salary spending in particular, districts are only spending about 4% more per student on teacher salaries than they were in 2004-05. So where is that benefit spending coming from? You probably know parts of this story already, but just real briefly, I've broken out benefit spending per student on health and welfare benefits. On top, you can see those have been increasing fairly steadily over time by about $250 per student since 2004-05. And then what you see is the next line down there is pension spending, which is increasing much more rapidly in recent years. That's to some extent because districts are hiring more staff, but primarily because districts have to make larger contributions on behalf of their staff to those pension systems. Now, special education and pensions, as Susanna mentioned, those are important enough to district budgets. They got dedicated reports in the Getting Down to Facts project, and you can go to either read those reports or go to a session dedicated to those subjects later. As a final point, I just want to draw your attention to the last two lines at the bottom there. That is per student spending on what are called other post-employment benefits, or OPEBs. Those are retirement benefits for district employees other than pensions. So most commonly, there are some districts that offer health insurance benefits to their employees after they retire, or offer them to their families after they retire. That's per student spending on those benefits for active employees and for retired employees. And what we're increasingly seeing is, even though those have been growing in total over time, not super rapidly, but what we are seeing is districts in the past, I should say, have often promised these health insurance benefits to their employees, but haven't necessarily set aside the money to pay for those benefits. Now, districts are increasingly responsible for making annual contributions to their OPEB plans, so to make sure that they have enough money set aside to pay these benefits as employees call them in as they retire. And we're also increasingly seeing employees retiring and calling these benefits in, which districts have not necessarily set aside money for. And so what we're increasingly seeing is districts reporting that they are not making their full annual required contributions to these OPEB plans. So they have employees earning benefits that they're not necessarily funding. At the bottom here, the bottom line shows just across the whole state, these are average liabilities. So these are the amounts, the unfunded amounts, the difference between what districts are supposed to be paying into their OPEB plans and what they're actually putting in. For all districts across the state, that bottom line down there shows that those net unfunded obligations. They're not huge. They're growing pretty steadily over time, up to about $40 per student statewide. But we're seeing more districts reporting these liabilities, and among the districts that are reporting these liabilities, reporting that they're not making the annual required contributions or the full amount of their annual required contributions, those liabilities they're reporting are quite large. That's the second line up there, about $1,000 per student in these net OPEB obligations for their employees. And that's going to be something also worth keeping an eye on going forward, as districts are increasingly needing to make these contributions, and employees are increasingly retiring and calling them in. So with that, I'm about out of time. I'm happy to talk about more of these things later in these small breakout groups. Thank you very much.
Very good job. These guys are on a tight time schedule. So Jennifer Imazeki is next, and Jennifer will describe what she knows about other states and how California compares a bit.
So good morning, and unlike Paul, I have no pictures to show you. So my paper was basically in some ways a big lit review. I went and looked at, we've been looking at adequacy and school finance for many, many years now. And so part of what I tried to do in the paper was present an overview of that literature. What do we know about what it costs to educate students up to whatever goals their states have set for them, and talked in the paper a little bit about the different methods that are used to do that. In particular, that literature has given us at least some information about the specific factors that we know increase those costs, that make it more costly for some districts than for others. And so I tried to pull together what we know about how big those costs are for those different factors, as well as looking at, aside from what the academic literature has to tell us, what are states actually doing? What do state formulas look like? What things do they include in their, as weights in their formulas, and what are the sizes of those weights and things like that? So the first half of the paper is really an overview of what we know about school funding formulas that determine the amount of money allocated to each individual district. But in school finance, we can think about there being sort of two sets of formulas that we usually think about. One is the formulas that determine the amount of money. The other is are the formulas that determine where that money comes from. So the second half of the paper looks at the formulas and the ways that states have divvied up the revenue, or determine how much revenue comes from the state versus local districts or other sources. So thinking about what those formulas look like as well. In general, as Susanna mentioned earlier in the overview, sort of one of the big takeaways is that overall, California is not spending as much as other states, particularly when you account for the costs of living here. I will point out that in my paper, all of the dollar figures across the states are adjusted, somewhat adjusted for comparable wages. So there's a index that's put together by the National Center for Education Statistics that tries to identify the differences overall and on average across states in what teachers need to be paid in terms of comparable wages. So I used that index to adjust the numbers. Even given that, right, so that does sort of inflate California's, deflate California's numbers a little bit, inflates the numbers for states that don't have as high of costs. We are spending on the lower end, and so that results, as Susanna pointed out, in having a lot fewer adults in schools and things like that.
We lose the slide there.
Oh, we lost. Oh, no. Okay, so let me see if that helps. That was odd. Okay, thank you. Am I? Right. Okay. So the other thing, as I said, I was looking at in particular is sort of how the formula breaks down, right? So compared to a decade ago, when it was very hard to say why districts were getting different amounts of the amounts of money that they were getting, we now have the local control funding formula, which says if you've got students that are in these particular categories, you're going to get this amount of money for each of those students. And so those weights that we have in the LCFF are actually pretty much in line with what the research says correspond to the additional costs for those students. So one thing I want to be clear about is that there's a lot of things that we don't know still, right? That there's no research supporting what we're doing, but there's no research supporting changing what we're doing either. So I try to point that out in the places in the paper where we just don't have as much information as we might like. What a lot of other states do in their formulas that we do not do in California is they might double count students. So we have our unduplicated student counts. There are a lot of states where students who are in poverty and also English learners get the money associated in their formulas for both those weights, right? And so when we look at the total amount that's being spent on high need students in California, it can look lower than in other states. And as has been mentioned many times, there are some states that adjust their formulas so that districts that have particularly high wage costs are also getting additional funding for that. On the second part of it about how we ensure, one of the questions that I was asked to look at early on was not just what is the formula, how much are districts getting for these different students, but how do we ensure that districts are spending the money in the way that that money is intended, right? That we get these targeted funds, are they going to the intended students? And I'll simply point out that there's really no way to do that through the formula that we have currently. Most other states that have weighted funding formulas like ours also don't have mechanisms to do that. The closest that I could find was Texas, which does treat the money that is allocated through the formula for those targeted students. It's allocated through the formula, but then it's sort of treated like a categorical in the sense that districts are held accountable for spending the money not on low-income students, which is the source of the weight, but on low-performing students. So the dollar amount is driven by the number of low-income students, but the accountability and how they're supposed to use it is tied to the performance of the students. So I thought that was one thing that people might be interested in looking at as an option. There's also federal rules coming down about tracking funding down to the school level, which is another way that some states are trying to ensure that funding is actually being spent on the students that are generating those funds. Then the second part of the paper, as I mentioned, has to do with where the money comes from in terms of local revenues versus state revenues. I think most folks who are here today understand that California, the revenue for our schools comes much more from the state than in pretty much any other state. We have significantly more, higher percentage of district revenues coming from state funding as opposed to local revenues. And that's in part because of Prop 13 and restrictions that we have here on local districts' ability to raise revenue. And so while the AAR paper talks about the need for that additional revenue, the question about where that revenue is going to come from is one that policymakers are really going to have to struggle with. The options for doing that locally are fairly limited. We have parcel taxes. That's something that California does that other states don't do. There are some issues with that. There are possibilities for things like sales taxes, private donations. There are some states that have local income taxes even. One thing to consider with any of those options is the equity implications. And I'm also presenting in the equity panel in the second breakout, and I'll talk a little bit more about that then. But the point is simply that the more we allow local districts to raise additional revenue, the more we have to be concerned about the variation across those districts in their ability to raise revenue. For the districts that are high income, high wealth, and able to raise lots of revenue, that's great. But what about the districts who don't have that ability just because of who's in their local districts and the local tax base available to them? And so we would need to think about even if we can allow local districts to raise additional revenue, that doesn't let the state off the hook because the state may need to equalize that for the districts that have lower ability to pay. And in the interest of time, I'll stop there and just get to the rest in questions.
Thank you. Okay. So, Juliana, you're. So Ileana's going to present the AIR adequacy study.
Put in my timer so that.
I'll tap you. Don't worry about
Thank
it.
you. Well, so I'm here with my colleague Jessie Levin, and I want to thank also our contributors, Julia Atkinson, Karen Manship, and Melissa Arellanes and Lynn Hu, who with them we did this study. And what we really wanted to know is,
There you go.
I'm too short. What does it cost to educate California students? And this was, as Susanna mentioned, a professional judgment panel. So our main question is first, okay, what constitutes an adequate education in California? What are the resources needed to enable California public school systems to provide all students with an adequate education? And what is the cost associated with this? So what did we do? So first we went and looked at what is the goal statement, and it was based on what the state has said it's like the accountability measures. Then we also commissioned 5 research practitioner briefs, and they were about at-risk students, English learners, special education, rural education, and successful programs in schools. And we also provided the panel with a brief about early education. Then we did this professional judgment panel. We had 2 panels, one in Northern California and the other one in Southern California, who were, there were 11 panelists who were highly educators, and we asked for a nomination process to different institutions. And they were composed of teachers and principals from elementary, middle, and high school. Then we also had an expert in early childhood learning, special education, English language learner, and a school finance expert, and a superintendent. We got them together and we asked them and say, okay, this is the actual allocation of what is going on in California, so please think about what would be ideal to get at the gold standard. Then we costed out the resource specifications of each of the panels. We then did some regression analysis. We estimated the district cost to get at the ancillary special education services and all the overhead like maintenance and administration and transportation, and then we produced the final cost estimates. So what did the panelists had to do? Well, we sent them a list of instructions, the 6 briefs, and then the goal statement. And then when we were together for 3 days, we started first with the typical school. So we told them, okay, this is how a typical school looks like in terms of the proportion of English learners, students in poverty, special education students. And then they were trying to get like at the overall picture, what does it look like to get at the program? They looked at student-teacher ratio, like the number of hours the students will be at school, the after-school program, and would they offer summer school? They also said, okay, how many teachers do we need? What was the distribution? Do we need a lot of experience or less of experience? What about all the aids, the curriculum? And then they were based on not only on the research, but also on their own experience. And then from this typical school, then we said, okay, what happens if now you have a school that has a very high percentage of students in poverty? How would you modify this? And then we said, okay, now you have a high incidence of students in poverty and then of high number of English language learners. So how does that look like? What additional resources you need to put in each of these programs? Then we said, okay, let's look at not a rural, but a smaller school. How would you change these resources? What is like special about, a smaller school compared to the typical school? And after that, we did an exercise about the district level special education ancillary services. And then the last task, which was very interesting, we said, okay, now you have designed your program for a typical school and all the resources needed. What would happen if there's a budget cut because it's California and you get 10% less? So how would you do that? So that was the main question. And all of them started thinking, what were the basic services and support they needed? And it was very interesting to see how they were discussing. And most of them landed, we want to keep the teacher ratios as they are, but you know what? We're not going to offer after school, but we're going to keep all the teacher aides and the special services. And they also were stressing a lot that they wanted like bilingual educators and supports for English language learners so that they would be a pushing model so that they could emphasize the content also, the content areas. So what did we find? So California in 2016-17 spends about $12,000 per student. And our estimation is that they would need about 16,000, almost 17,000 per student to achieve this adequate cost. So it's 38% more. And if we take a step back and see what did we found 10 years ago, well, we're doing it much better because last adequacy study, we found that California needed to spend about 50% more of what they were spending. So now we only need 38%.
Gee.
So then we wanted to see how does that, is it the same across all poverty levels? So what we do is we divided in quartiles and we saw that the gap between what is the actual spending versus the adequate spending is larger in those districts with higher poverty. So it's about 46%. Then what about where the districts are located? And this is also, it's not surprising, but the estimated gap is larger in rural districts. But, okay, you're going to be scared, 46%, that represents a lot of money. But if we look at how the students, where the students are located, you see that rural students actually are like not, they represent a lower percentage of what needs to be spent. So the majority of the resources need to be spent in city and suburb districts. We did a very nice exercise looking at what was like the relationship between achievement and the gap between adequate and actual. And what we saw is that those districts that have a larger gap also perform at a lower level. And lastly, because I'm almost running out of time, what we've been saying, oh, you know what, like California really spends at the lower level. Well, it's true. If we see now where, like the actual, you see the two green lines are the California actual and then the estimated. So if we compare the adequacy estimated cost, we see that Massachusetts, it's about 2% above our estimated cost, Vermont to Connecticut about 15 to 17, and New York to 28. And then looking at how they are, their levels of achievement, I went back to NAEP, and so what was happening in 2015 and 17, and we see that Massachusetts, it's at the top, Vermont, New Jersey, they're also above, like what the US average is, whereas California is really low. So the key findings are California needs to spend 38% more to achieve this adequate education, and the gap is larger in districts with higher poverty and those located in smaller towns and rural areas. And why it seems large, this 25.6 million, is actually not as large as we think when we compare to other states. And the sad part is that this is the lower bound because, as Bruno was saying, we're not taking into account all the pension costs. Thank you.
That's a lot of information really fast. So, California's better off than it was in terms of per pupil amount by a little bit. But we know that the resources vary a lot. And in a lot of cases, that is due to differences in local revenues and local districts' ability to raise revenues. We also, Jennifer reminded us that there are two ways to think about school finance. We think about how much money there is, and we also think about where the money comes from. And California's approach of LCFF, there's no evidence that says it's not a solid strategy, and there's very little evidence to say that for sure it is. So there we are. But we also know that California really stands apart in terms of local school districts' ability to raise revenues. And those of us who've been around for a while absolutely know that. And the adequacy study really gives us a window into thinking about both what it looks like to have a school that has the resources that are needed in order to meet expectations, and then what it might cost. And valuable numbers, and I especially like that last slide with the state comparisons. I was very glad to see that. So what we're going to do now is take questions, and what I would like you to do is if you will stand up if you have a question. I don't think we've got a mic out there, so speak loudly, and please introduce yourselves. Rick, you want to start?
Do you want to move to the previous slide?
For pupil funding in the last half dozen years. Oh, there we go. The increase in per pupil funding with all the associated subsets and things, it sounded like you were attributing the increase causally to the enactment of LCFF. And I wasn't sure whether you meant that or not.
No, I'm sorry. I was just using that as sort of a
as a
historical
timeline
benchmark point.
indicator.
Yeah,
Okay.
as an indicator of this is when that.
Got it. Okay.
that
And then
happened. There's a lot of moving.
got it.
parts.
I would concur with the sort of presumed conclusion that of Jennifer's and others that making it easier to raise local revenues may well be part of our long-term solution. And
Gee, Rick.
anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Jonathan.
So I just have a point of clarification in terms of the prior professional judgment panel study and this one. Would you consider them comparable? In other words, when we were talking about the two studies and what the difference was between this at 38% and the other one at 51 to 73%?
So thanks. That's an excellent question. And so no, the two studies were different in a variety of respects, which would not make the numbers completely comparable. So for one, the goal statement was very different. Back in the original study, which I directed, we were still using the API, right? So and now in this study, we went to the 5x5 accountability, the dashboard matrix, right? So that's one reason why if you have different goals, you would expect to come up with different things. I mean, I think the other thing though is that spending on education has changed over time, and so that contributes to it somewhat as well. And it's hard to say how much our relative increase in spending on education has cut down that. The original report, actually, I believe it was, I think it was 51%. One of the panels, the calculations were 51%. The other one was like 71% or something like that. And then John Sonstely from UC Santa Barbara did a separate study, completely independent, and he came up with a conclusion saying we have to spend at least 40% more. So it's a big range. I mean, the idea is that it's a significant amount more that we have to spend. What we've come up with this time is different for a variety of reasons. It also could have been that the panelists were just more efficient or thought that their program specifications could be more efficient than from last time around. Thanks.
Yes.
Mike Fine, FICMAT. Paul, the question's for you on your chart, a little bit associated to Rick's question, and that is, where did you put the one-time? We've had almost $7 billion in the last 6 years of one-time money on a per ADA that doesn't follow the LCFF formula. What categories did that fall in? Those are obviously all Prop 98, but were they in the LCFF line or in the other state?
Those, what I believe, have gone into the other state line.
Even though it dipped? If I recall the chart, that line actually dips, which...
Yeah, so there's certainly a few places where I mostly just followed however the districts categorized it. So I wasn't making a whole lot of decisions. I think it would have been the...
Is that it?
No, I think...
No, it's a revenue line.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, maybe...
There you go. You just, I think...
Oh, so just to be clear, so this is looking at 2016-17 only, and it's looking across districts with different and duplicated pupil shares, so it wouldn't necessarily... We wouldn't expect a one-time spike.
It's that one.
Well, in some respects, hasn't been entirely one time. It's been varying amounts that we've
Right.
had each year. They're not insignificant
Oh, is maybe he mean even the slide before that? Is that possible?
Well, this shows restricted and unrestricted,
Oh.
which is
That's okay.
part of the question.
In this case, it's probably reflected in that darker upper piece, right? I was more curious where you were capturing it in your labeling.
Yeah.
A little bit to Rick's point of.
Yeah, so I believe when that money came in, districts were told the way they were told to code for it, it would fall into like an other state category, and so that's where it would fall.
Okay. Don't look at the screen. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Maureen O'Leary-Burness, and I'm here as a special educator, but also from kind of a federal perspective here. So I'm wondering, did you look at any of the other federal funds, for example, Medi-Cal, EPSDD through California Mental Health, or any kind of interagency cooperation and blended funding?
This is for me in particular. No. So I didn't look. I didn't break down federal revenues in very much detail. In California, they're a relatively small part. Total, yeah. So maybe too small, yeah. So, and you can see that I think on one of the slides. This is just a small share of most districts' budgets, unless they have a lot of unduplicated students. So they're relatively low-income districts.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Hannah Escada with Californians for Justice, and my question's for Jennifer. So you mentioned that California is unique for having the unduplicated counts. I was just curious if there's any inkling as to what the figure would be if there was a number for all the students who are duplicates in the target groups in LCFF.
I'm sure there is, but I have no idea off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the counts, right? We know how many students fall in those different categories, but I have not looked at that data.
Does anybody in the audience have that
I was
number
gonna
off the
say
top of their
somebody else
head?
might know.
I know that it's there. It's that the total number, if you didn't do unduplicated, of low income and EL together. I know that number is available.
Are you asking how many students fall into both categories,
Either
or
one or the other.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
There you go. John.
Good morning, John.
What happened to our mic? There we go.
A question about the weights. Jennifer, you said the LCFF weights more or less were supported by research on what it costs for additional education. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, and because I know other states like New Jersey gives like 50% more for high need students, and also be curious if AIR folks could talk about weights and anything that their research says about the proper weights for kids, if you looked into that. Thanks.
Across the states, there's a huge range, right? So again, the paper goes into a lot more detail about that for the different specific factors that different states have weights for. I tried to summarize what we know in terms of the range, the average, things like that. So I can't remember off the top of my head, but there are some states that have very much higher weights. There are also states that have lower weights or don't use weights. And so it's a little hard, I think, to make an argument that it has to be either higher or lower based on what other states are doing, because you could always find a state that has a different weight, right? But the literature there's a huge literature looking at sort of the cost of adequacy, right? Using different methods. So economists tend to use cost functions. There's the professional judgment. There's evidence-based. Most of them for poverty are somewhere in the 30% range. If I had to say there is one number that most people would say is about right, it'd be 30% for poverty. As I mentioned, though, that's in some cases that's usually not using a duplicated count, right? Or controlling for all other characteristics of students. I'll also say that California's LCFF is now, we went from having a completely convoluted unable to describe in simple terms formula to having one of the most streamlined, most simplest with only a few things in it. Most states do have, in this case, more complicated formulas than California has now because they have more things in their formulas, more things that they're waiting for.
We've got a question over here, Martha, or,
Well, the AAR
oh, I'm sorry.
folks did have
I'm
some-
sorry.
So, John, this is a great question. I think what's really important for all of you out there, when you're looking at other states, it's not just about the weight. The weight is a relative measure, okay? You also have to take into account the weight in combination with the base per pupil funding that it's being applied to. And there can be a certain trade-off there, right? So let's say that we have another state that has a very, very low weight, but it has a very high base, right? You want to take that into account as well because that enters the adequacy picture, right? So what we did for our study, just in a nutshell, and I can talk to you about this afterwards, is we took our projections, our adequacy projections, and we did what's called an implicit weight analysis. So basically we did a regression to say, our adequate per pupil spending across districts, we want to explain that with a variety of student needs factors and scale, economies of scale factors. So basically saying, let's describe our adequate per pupil projections as a function of percent of students on eligible for free or reduced price lunch, percent of students who are EL, percentage of students who are special education, and a variety of factors. And then we saw what that estimated relationship, that is how responsive is adequate per pupil cost to free and reduced price lunch. We did the exact same analysis with actual spending, which emulates what's going on under LCFF, right? And then we compared, and our results show that if we were to provide an adequate cost projections to all districts, the relationship between, say, at-risk or, say, unduplicated counts and spending would be more progressive, stronger. The weight would be higher. Okay. So we have a table in the report that shows you by how much, and it's not just for free and reduced price lunch, it's also for EL. We actually break those out separately. So we kind of do this analysis, treating weights separately, an EL weight separate from an FRL weight separate from a special ed weight, as opposed to the unduplicated version that LCFF contains right now. So it'll give you a little extra information as well. Is that helpful? And we can talk more about it. Lou. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So remember, the 20% is just for that supplemental. So you have to take into account the whole enchilada here, right? And my calculations, I think it was about 45% if you take the average weight across all students. So that's taking into account that 20% up to your 55% concentration, and then the additional after the 55%. And I've got a calculation on that too that I can share with you. But my calculations were about a weight of about 0.45 when all is said and done across the whole range.
Okay, we've got 5 more minutes for questions, and then you guys have to start doing the work. And there are several people over here that had questions. You guys can fight it out. Who wants to?
Good morning, Martha Alvarez with AXA, the Association of California School Administrators. 2 quick questions, although they're bigger conversations for future discussions. One clarifying question on the 38% per pupil spending increase. Did that account for fixed cost and like pension, special ed, not just the basic services?
It did. It accounted for virtually all of those
Everything.
Fixed costs. When Ileana was talking about that these are lower bound estimates, that could have been a little confusing. We did not do any projections for the increase in pension burden that we know is coming down the pike, like necessarily, unless there's a miracle in Sacramento and they fix this overnight, which is not going to happen. So it does account for what we would call operational spending.
Okay. Great.
Okay.
And the follow-up question,
yes.
so $25 billion of increases is not a new number. It's different than back in 2007. But I'm curious whether you explored what would be the mix of tax reform issues. I know you mentioned a couple on the slide that won't generate 25 billion local revenues, income tax, et cetera. I didn't see oil severance or other revenue mixes. And I'm wondering, because Cal Matters had an article recently that pointed out, it would be 1/3 more income, 100% more commercial tax. So what would that look like? Because 25 billion is a lot of money. And who would you encourage to look into how to come up with those numbers?
Yeah,
And the solution.
So this study did not look at revenue solutions at all. There's virtually nothing on there.
So the people in the room are going to get to discuss that question. But go on.
I was just going to say, what I looked at was sort of what are the options that other states have used, but I don't think anybody has, certainly I didn't, and I think I would have been the only one who would have even thought about it, have looked at the amount that could be raised through specific policy proposals. There isn't anything in any of the papers like that.
And this is a pretty old discussion. There is an excellent EdSource brief from 2009 by an author named Mary Perry. That if you wanted it, obviously there are no simulations in there, and they wouldn't be good for nowadays anyway. But it goes over a lot of the different options that might be out there that are still being considered right now. And I know there are others of you that know probably more about it than I do.
So can we shift to the other side of the room? I know you've been trying to ask your question as well, but were there folks over here that had questions?
Yeah,
All right.
so-
Got one here. And then hopefully, if we keep this really brief, we can get back and get yours.
Hi, good morning. My name is Audra Pittman. I'm the superintendent for the Bayshore Elementary School District in Daly City. As this has been said, this isn't new information for us. And the question that I'm going to ask, this may not be the right venue, so tell me, or it's a bigger question. I've had the luxury of, over the past month, having 2 different sit-downs with my local legislator, both individually as well as with a larger group. And the message that they are saying is that we've given you more money, you just need to prioritize how you're spending that money. And I'm composing myself. And it doesn't, if I need $16 and I'm only getting 10, it doesn't matter how I prioritize. So my question is what are our next steps? Because me having a sit down with him and him telling me that we have given you more money when I know I need 38% more, what is the next step for us as California educators?
Okay, here's what I want to do, because you're right, their research didn't go there. How about, is your question relevant to the research, or is it moving us on? Let's take your question, and then you are going to start having exactly that conversation.
Thank you, everyone. Ken Capon with the Legislative Analyst's Office. I wanted to ask you, going back to other states, how other states are defining poverty within their funding formulas. In California, we use free or reduced price meals. That seems like captures a very broad swath of students in the state. Have other states tried other measures of poverty that might be a little bit more nuanced? Have you looked at that at all?
I'm thinking because is this on? I don't want to get into specifics, because I don't know off the top of my head which states do what in this regard. But most states do also use free and reduced price lunch. The only other measures that I can recall seeing are things like local income, household income directly from like census kind of measures. And I really can't think of any other alternative measures that would be used at the state, in a state formula.
So here's one perhaps change that we might be seeing, and that is more reliance on direct certification measures, because the free and reduced price lunch measures, there can be some pitfalls for them, in particular with the community eligibility provision. So basically, there are guidelines that say, listen, if you have a very high proportion of students that are in poverty, we're not going to force you to collect every year and get get their parents to basically sign the rolls saying that they're low income. So to try to reduce that burden, they say you're a community eligibility provision school, and we're just going to consider you 100%. You can offer free and reduced price lunch to all of your students, and they monitor that I think every couple of years. But it can wreak havoc on research, right? Because we have a certain amount of schools that are just listed at 100%. So there is. In some of the research that we've done in another study for Getting Data Facts, we were looking at direct certification counts, which is more of a poverty measure. Remember, we use free and reduced price lunch as a proxy, but that's really it's the free and reduced price measures are based on 135% and I think 180 or 85% of the federal threshold. So these direct certification measures are things like, is your family eligible for SNAP and things that are really based on the poverty level. So any weights that were based on that would have to be commensurately different, right? Because the threshold is much more stringent. I mean, it's a much more stringent definition of poverty than. So I hope that helps. I don't have anything off the top of my head either, and I know we have to break out now.
Yep. Yeah. So what we're going to do, the researchers will all be here while you're all having your discussions, and you can, if you have a really pressing question, tap them on the shoulder. In the meantime, we're going to have time for 3 table discussion questions. The first is what stood out for you most from this research. The second is, what do you see as the most pressing changes needed, thinking about all those different ways that you might think about where the money comes from and how it gets allocated. And then based on this research, what do you think should be the top priorities for the next legislature and administration? So I'm going to give you just a couple minutes to get grounded at your tables so you get to know each other a little bit and grapple with this question, and then we'll switch to the real question.